Hello there, my name's Megan. I work here at the Troy Local History and Genealogy Center. We are a branch of the Troy Miami County Public Library. And today I'm going to be walking you through some of the historic Troy social clubs, 9 of them specifically. This is a study of fun, fulfillment, and philanthropy. So, by way of introduction, Albert Einstein once said, "Man is, at one and the same time, a solitary being and a social being." You may have heard it said another way. Someone said, "People, you can't live with them, you can't live without them." And that rings true, I would say. So, in America, social clubs became very prominent in the late 1800s and on. This was due in part to massive amounts of progress and innovation that made daily life easier for the middle and upper classes. In Troy specifically, gone were the days of crude log homes and dawn to dusk labor to merely survive. Aesthetic appeal could now be attained in housing, clothing, transportation, and everyday products. Inventions came along to assist with housework and business maintenance, and some folks found themselves for once with leisure time on their hands. As a result, many people, men and women, would form and or join social clubs. Some clubs were for self-improvement and the betterment of society, and some clubs were simply for pleasure or recreation. We'll now take a look at a few distinctly Troy social clubs, and we'll see what all the excitement was about. So club number 1 is the Altrurian Club. The Altrurian Club of Troy, Ohio was officially organized in 1894 by a core group of 12 women who wanted to keep up with the changing times. Their purpose was the betterment of society at large through personal philanthropy and also the expansion of their minds through continued education. They placed an emphasis on the home and family, as many women did at the time, while also reaching out to those less fortunate in the community. Their motto was, quote, "In essentials, harmony, in non-essentials, liberty, in all things, charity," end quote. Notable membership includes, but is not limited to, the women pictured on this slide. When you examine their lives through records, you see that each overcame great personal tragedy. To the left is Mrs. Hannah Gahagan, who was a highly educated Troy woman that married into a prominent Miami County pioneer family. She was widowed at a young age when her husband, a Civil War veteran, died of an ailment acquired during the war. She brought up her 3 children, was a school teacher, and was very active socially. She would eventually become a charter member of the Altrurian Club. The top right photo is that of Clara Williams, who was in fact Troy's first librarian. She too was married to a Civil War veteran, but was widowed when he died in the Dayton Insane Asylum after the war. The bottom right photo is of Mamie Scobie, a local mover and shaker whose husband, interestingly, became a federal mint director. Mamie's life, though useful, was cut short by appendicitis shortly after this photo was taken. She died in 1905 while serving as president of the Altrurian Club. Both Clara and Mamie lost their only child at young ages due to illness. All of these women are buried in Riverside Cemetery here in Troy. The clubhouse where they met still stands on Franklin Street, and you can see an interior shot of it on the screen on that right side. This is where the Altrurians would hold their meetings, which consisted of robust discussion on current and historic events, the recitation of poetry, lectures, and many fundraisers. They studied books and encyclopedias to gain knowledge of architecture, political philosophy, economics, and literature. They even organized a course on parliamentary law. A constitution was adopted that outlined the vision and purpose for the club, as well as the particulars of electing officers, membership fees, and general workings of the group. One of the first orders of business for the Altrurians was the establishment of a free public library, a goal which they attained through the support and generosity of many Trojans. A library room opened on the second floor of the city building on South Market. The Altrurians also advocated for child labor laws, better conditions for incarcerated women and children, art in the public schools, feeding undernourished school children, and more. They supported the Red Cross, collected money for Christmas gifts for the poor, and were instrumental in getting legislation passed that required special eye drop serum to be administered to infants to prevent blindness. They produced a popular cookbook that was sold to raise funds for the club. Many of the common humanitarian social services that the government now provides was offered locally by the Altrurians through the generosity of the private sector. The club was officially secular in nature, although many of its members were deeply religious, and this impacted much of what they sought to accomplish in society. They disbanded in 1997 after more than 100 years of activism. So here on the left is an image of the sheet music for the club's song, composed by Francis Moore Geiger, a famous Troy artist. For further research on the Altrurians, you can come to the Troy Local History and Genealogy Center to view the club history book, penned by Mrs. Estella Broomhall, who is pictured on the right. She wrote the following of the club in her introduction, quote, "They were broad-minded and far-visioned women who expressed a desire to form an organization which would not only benefit the individual members, but one that would have the respect and support of the community, and ever prove a power for good through generations to come. Self-seeking and arrogance were to have no place if it could be avoided, only an earnest desire to fit women for leadership in all that would uplift home and community." End quote. This pretty well sums it up, and in case you were wondering, the Altrurian cookbook is also available for viewing at our History Center. Club number 2, the Island Outing Club. So here we have an example of a club that was created specifically for pleasure and recreation. We've all got to have some relaxation after all. The Island Outing Club was organized in 1893 by some prominent Troy business people who, understandably, needed an outlet for rest and relaxation. They had picnics, camping trips, boating, and other such light activity. It was technically a guys-only club, but female companionship to events was allowed and even encouraged, especially where food preparation was concerned. The island mentioned in the name was the Hangout, and it was located on the Miami River right outside of Troy. The club paid a yearly rental fee to the state of Ohio for the use of this island. You can see on this slide that they constructed quite the clubhouse with 2 stories and ample porches. It was built in 1894. Some famous local surnames on the early membership rolls include Allen, Coleman, Haney, Hayner, Broomhall, and more. So one of the club trustees was none other than Augustus G. Stouter, who started the Troy Foundation. He was also the president of the Hobart Electric Manufacturing Company and gave $200,000 of his own money to build the local hospital that would bear his name for so many years. The other picture shows a July 1894 picnic event at the island. Over 200 people were present, and it was apparently quite the occasion. On this 1911 plat of Concord Township, you can see both Island number 1 and 2. First Island, as it was called, was the site of most of what I have just described, although some members of the club built summer cottages on Island number 2. So here we have more photos from a July 4th, 1897 picnic that the Island Outing Club hosted. The article from 1893 gives a good write-up of another island picnic affair. I will read it to you from the screen here. It says, "The Island Outing Club had a picnic Tuesday. The entire day was passed on the island, enjoying the cool breezes, fishing, sleeping, hammock swinging, and eating. 50 members and invited guests took their dinner and supper on the grounds, waiting until after dark before returning home in order to preserve the purity of their complexions. So let us indeed hope that no complexions were spoiled. The Island Outing Club had a comparatively brief existence when we realize it disbanded around 1917. The 1913 flood had much to do with this, as the clubhouse was washed away and the grounds were tarnished greatly. In 1916, talk began of merging the fledgling Island Outing Club with the Troy Club, which we will discuss a little later. So club number 3 is the Polecats. So not many people are familiar with this club, maybe for good reason, but we will get right into it. So this might be Troy's best kept secret, maybe, maybe not, but there was indeed a club of Troy's youth who referred to themselves as the Polecats, due to their clubhouse being on the Polecat Road. Polecat is, of course, another term for a skunk. It was founded circa 1945, and when you think about it, this was a time when we were coming out of the darkness and bloodshed of the Second World War. This club, in a way, represents a breath of fresh air and a revival of youthful innocence and fun, mostly. The club was never officially incorporated, but I've decided it earns honorable mention. It existed throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, and the purpose of the club, as best I can tell, was mostly pranks and good times, often involving pyrotechnics. It was a secret club with mostly secret membership, but there was in fact a book published on the Polecats by one of its founding members. It is available for reading at the local history and genealogy center. The catch? The full names of the club members are omitted in the book. Only initials are used, save for the name of the author who was a member. However, it's amazing what one can accomplish given access to yearbooks, the census, and county directories. If you really put your mind to it, you can kind of decode the names that way using the initials and the author's yearbook, just looking at him and his contemporaries bearing those initials. So that was a fun project if ever you're interested in trying. But anyway, the author David Benson Carver was born in 1935 and did most of his growing up in Troy. As I mentioned, he was one of the charter members of the Polecats, and he served as the club president. I do not know how many members there were total, but it was definitely a decent-sized group. His book covering their history is witty and extremely entertaining. In terms of club business, they met regularly and with great formality. Their hideout on Polecat Road only admitted club members, no exceptions. It is not clear what the terms of membership were, but members were mostly young teens. As you can see on the screen, each member was issued this flag to drape over their coffin upon their demise. The schemes of the club members range from amusing to alarming, with some gray area in between. There was a club budget of sorts for matches, firecrackers, and the like that were used for pranks and recreation. Their antics included ding-dong ditching, prank phone calls to some of the most prominent Troy businessmen, and, as I mentioned before, pyrotechnics. So here is a rare photo of some of the polecats. There are more in the book. Also pictured is a copy of the club newsletter titled The Polecat Papers. The newsletter was started in hopes of raising enough money for more incendiary equipment. It doesn't grow on trees, after all, we all know this. Unfortunately, Mr. Carver records that no subscriptions were gained from the newsletter, and the production thereof was immediately ceased. They gave it their best shot, however. The club went on strong until the members left childhood behind and reached college age. However, there was a last hurrah type reunion in 1988 on the Polecat Road, and the book leaves us at a cliffhanger. Shall the Polecats, those who are left, meet again? Only time will tell. So, as a postscript, it should be mentioned that many of the club members, from what I can tell, grew up to be above average people as well as influential and productive members of society. The charter members actually were quite impressive, graduating from college, owning businesses, authoring books, and serving in the military. So our next club is the Girls Civic League. The Girls Civic League was formed in the year 1920 by 28 progress-minded women and girls. Initially, the club wanted to specifically focus on the betterment of Troy's young folk, but eventually their purpose became broader in scope. It was officially decided that their purpose as a club was to, quote, promote social and intellectual betterment, including questions of the hour, local conditions, civic betterment, and the study of literature, art, and good music, end quote. They were very similar to the Altrurian Club in this regard, and could in fact be considered the next generation of women, as the Altrurians had been going strong as a club for nearly 30 years by the time the Girls Civic League formed. Their club motto was "Barkis is willing," as a toast to the Charles Dickens novel David Copperfield. This motto was to signify the club members' willingness to accomplish their goals regardless of how difficult or unfamiliar the task. They did indeed accomplish much. They hosted lectures, dances, and discussions on current events and civic duty. They promoted Red Cross work, various fundraisers, and were ever attentive to the residents of the Knoop Children's Home, especially during the holidays. They met at first in the various homes of their members, but eventually raised enough money to purchase the historic John Kitchen House, which was built in 1847 and is now the Museum of Troy History. This would be their clubhouse and meeting place for years to come, and the museum to this day retains their scrapbooks. Notable membership of the club includes some of the gals in this photo. The ladies in this picture were well known in Troy. Ruth Hartley, at the far left, was the last remaining charter member of the club and had seen the Girls Civic League through its inception, infancy, and on. The picture inset on the right is Annalisa Golden Tiffany, yet another club member. She was born in 1913 and grew up in Troy on Drury Lane and later Lincoln Avenue. She was involved in many local relief efforts here during the Great Depression and was educated at Worcester College, where she became editor of the renowned school newspaper, The Worcester Voice. Anne, as she was known later, became a psychiatric social worker for the American Red Cross, where she traveled the world offering her services. In the end, she would be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. She was 101 years old when she passed. So I mentioned that the Girls Civic League was especially attentive to the residents of Knoop Children's Home. Here are some news articles and photos about their faithful service and charity toward the kids during the holidays. And fun fact, the claim is that the Leaguers were responsible for placing and decorating the very first Christmas tree on the public square here in Troy in the year 1920. Here is a photo of the tree on the square in 1926 at the bottom left there. Our next club is the Troy Bicycle Club, which was organized in July of 1882 with an initial membership of 10. The so-called bicycle craze would hit in the 1890s, and this offered an excellent way for people to unwind and see new scenery without spending money on a lavish vacation. The Bicycle Club, like many, would undergo changes through the years, merging with other clubs and being renamed. It would eventually be renamed the Economy Club with the motto of "the most fun for the least amount of money." In 1890, the safety bicycle made its appearance in Troy, and a new-ish club was formed, dubbed the Troy Cycling Club. The club was mostly men to start out with, and they made bicycle excursions to Dayton, New Carlisle, Urbana, and Sydney. Despite their extremely restrictive clothing, women also picked up the hobby, and one Troy schoolteacher, Adelaide Cosley, became well known locally for her fondness of bicycle riding. She is pictured on this slide in the middle wearing the black bow tie. The bicyclers would rent rooms and throw parties, and also make appearances on their wheels for the 4th of July parades in the public square. Later on, when membership was dwindling, the club would merge with the Troy Club, which again we'll be getting to. Notable membership of the Troy Bicycling Club included a man named Harry Julian, who was the president of the club at the time of its formation in 1882. Mr. Julian sold and repaired bicycles here in Troy. This is a picture of his shop on the right-hand side here. So what better way to promote business for your shop than to start a club that utilizes your product? His shop was on Walnut Street, and it prospered from the 1880s to the 1920s. So looking at the picture of the frame building here, the Redmond's Hall would be on the right, and the Asa Mayo House is visible to the left. There is still a Julian Court over this way too. I assume it's related somehow. And this frame building in focus is no longer in existence. It has been torn down. So on this slide is pictured a Troy family posing with their bicycles. This address was 603 West Water Street, and the house is no longer there to my knowledge. Our next club is the Troy Grandmothers Club. So the Troy Grandmothers Club was founded in 1956, and it was a branch of a larger group known as the National Federation of Grandmothers, which was founded around 1938. This larger national group was keen on changing society's perception of grandmothers. They wanted people to see this demographic as alert, involved, and active socially. The Troy Grandmothers Club also probably had this ideal in mind, but the focus for them seemed to be more on creating a support network for each other and for fellow senior citizens in the community. If someone was in the hospital, they brought food for the family. They often met in local churches for meetings and events, and at times even hosted plays, concerts, and the like. They raised money for needy families and provided them with food for the holidays. Some of the grandmothers had lost a spouse or a child, or they were raising a grandchild. Some senior citizens were shut-ins. The Grandmothers Club ensured that these people wouldn't struggle alone. They provided an outlet for fun, laughter, and philanthropic endeavors. Notable membership of the Troy Grandmothers Club includes Nettie Anderson Wintringham, 1894 to 1984, who was the first club president. Their first meeting was in her home. She was also a member of, wait for it, the Troy Altrurian Club. Her life would be considered fairly typical as she grew up, married, had several kids, but her life is atypical when we realize how involved she was in local relief efforts. The newspaper database attests to her fervent public service over many decades. The picture on the right is more amusing than anything. It is a photo from the Troy Daily News of Marlene Dietrich, who was a famous actress back in the day. The National Federation of Grandmothers voted her, quote, the most romantic grandmother of 1950, end quote. Who knew? So as a side note, the Troy Historical Society retains the Troy Grandmothers Club meeting minutes from 1956 to 1980. The Troy Local History and Genealogy Center has a partnership and a shared collection with the Troy Historical Society, and so those Grandmothers Club meeting minutes are accessible. Our next club is the Lowell and Whittier Societies. So both of these groups were organized in 1894. These were two Troy High School literary societies who were, believe it or not, bitter rivals. The two groups were named for the great American poets pictured on this screen, James Russell Lowell and John Greenleaf Whittier. The rival societies often held their meetings and competitions in the famed auditorium of the Edwards School building, which is now the site of the main Troy Library. It may seem strange in our modern culture, but at this time, the American public was hungry for intellectual stimulation, probing literature, and riveting but classy debate. The purpose of these two high school societies was to compete through debate, play acting, reciting poetry, producing comedy, and lecturing in front of an audience comprised of the public. Debate seemed to be a favorite pastime, and they argued everything from national politics to local civic issues. The audience would score each team based on their performance, and whoever received the most votes in the end won the contest. The competitions were wildly popular, and many people turned out to see the Lowells and the Whittiers wage intellectual warfare with one another. The rivalry, in fact, became so serious that it was no longer confined to the competitions in the Edwards School auditorium. Thomas Wheeler, the great Troy historian, wrote that the names Lowell and Whittier were sometimes written on sidewalks or on the sides of buildings, sometimes with derogatory comments afterwards. There was a constant tension over which team's flag would be flown on the school flagstaff, and on occasions there were physical altercations between the rival club members. Tom Wheeler also writes that it was considered very bad form for a Lowell boy to go out with a Whittier girl and vice versa. So pictured up top here is Persis Johnson, a 1918 graduate of Troy High School. She was a member of the Lowell Society. A history of the two societies was published in her 1918 school yearbook, which is also available for viewing at the local History and Genealogy Center. Persis here, she married her fellow Troy High School graduate, and I did my best to try and find out if he was perhaps a Whittier, because that would be funny if it was like a forbidden romance, but I could not divine that information as he graduated before the yearbooks had started for Troy, so we don't know, but that would be funny. Our next club is the Troy Junior Girls Canteen. The Troy Junior Girls Canteen was organized circa 1942 in the wake of the Second World War. Thousands of soldiers were being mobilized around the country, and many would pass through Troy, Ohio, on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad near West Street. A group of 19 young Troy girls began to notice the weary soldiers, some of whom were barely past teenage years, and began to plot how they could increase the morale and administer to the needs of America's young sons who were going off to war. The girls began swiping magazines and snacks from their own homes to give to the passing soldiers at the station. Eventually, the mothers became a little suspicious and accompanied their girls to the concrete platform by the B&O station. There, the mothers too saw the needs of the young and anxious soldiers. A group was assembled, and the Troy Junior Girls Canteen was born. Mothers, daughters, and many business and private citizens began donating to this effort to increase the comfort of the soldiers coming and going at the station. Cookies, pies, sandwiches, magazines, playing cards, and notes of encouragement flooded into the Junior Girls Canteen Clubhouse, which was nestled just a little ways away from the train station at what is now Hurlinger Park. Someone even donated the girls a trailer, which they filled with their treats and brought to the platforms or the station at the platform, ready to distribute. Here we have some photos of the Troy Canteen girls in action. The top two photos are from the collection of Betty Baldwin, who was the youngest canteen girl at the age of 6. She is pictured sitting at the front in the picture on the right. Below is a picture of canteen girl Mary Lou Scott from her Troy High School yearbook in 1945. At its peak, this group of girls had grown to 40 strong. The club disbanded after the war was over, and there were no longer masses of soldiers to feed and encourage at the train station. But the impact these young women had was far-reaching. They couldn't possibly have anticipated the overwhelming response they received in these post-war years. Hundreds of soldiers wrote letters of sincere thanks and praise for the morale boost offered by the Troy Junior Girls Canteen Group. The girls, of course, would take no money from the soldiers, and so some of the men gave the girls their insignia patches from their uniforms as a way of saying thanks. One veteran even came back to Troy, Ohio, years later to personally thank Betty Baldwin and her mother for their kindness. So for further reading or research on the Troy Junior Girls Canteen, come on into the local History and Genealogy Center. We have Scott Trossel's book on the Canteen Girls, as well as 2 huge binders of letters, photocopied letters, that the soldiers wrote to thank the girls. Additionally, you can conduct research on them via the digitized newspaper database. So our next club is the Varsity Club / the Troy Club. So firstly, the Varsity Club was organized in Troy around 1912 with the intent of being a men's club that invested particularly in youth. Even at this time in history, there were plenty of vices for a young man to fall victim to, and the Varsity Club members strove to promote the betterment of society by intercepting at-risk young men. This club was actually similar in scope to the already established Young Men's Christian Association, or the YMCA, but as best I can tell, the Varsity Club was technically secular in nature. They held dances, recreational outings, and fundraisers similar to the other groups that we've examined. On more than one occasion, a well-established or affluent member of Troy society would speak at Varsity Club events or open their home to the club members for visits. The older and established men were intent on supplying the younger men with the skills and outlook for success in life. The Varsity Club also came into clutch in helping the Troy Boy Scouts raise money for much-needed equipment. The picture on this slide here was taken on the 3rd floor of the Dye Building, which currently houses the restaurant The Caroline. And the windows have not changed much, I will say that. That's kind of the giveaway. So something also promoted by the Varsity Club was a keen sense of patriotism, and they would hit their stride especially during the First World War. Many of the club members were or would become active service members, and active soldiers and veterans were requested to wear their uniforms to events. In June of 1918, the club held a memorial service and flag dedication. They honored not only their 31 service members, but also 4 of their young members, aged 15 to 19, who had died of illness. Sometimes we forget that an illness such as pneumonia or influenza could easily result in death at this time in history, even for a healthy young person. The oration was given by Baird Broomhall, who was a prominent Troy lawyer. At the time of his death at age 81, he was believed to be the oldest actively practicing attorney in town. Mr. Broomhall's 1918 address to the Varsity Club took place at the Methodist Church here in town, and he spoke of his friend who had died on the battlefield in service to his country. He stated, quote, "When something happens and we realize a friend is gone forever, we remember him not for the big things he did, nor for his money, but by the little unremembered acts of kindness." He emphasized that the 4 young club members who had died had indeed embodied this ideal with their lifestyles, even though they had not seen combat. He stated that, quote, "They did the best they knew how and led clean lives, good lives, honorable lives. Their memory impresses these men at home and those gone across the sea at war. They not only lived, but died, unwhimpering and unafraid." End quote. The photo on the right side of the slide was taken on the third floor of the old Style building, which became Ullman's but burned in 1970 due to arson. Now the site is Prouty Plaza. Now, the Varsity Club existed independently until 1924 when they merged with the Troy Club. The Troy Club was organized circa 1890 and was another social/recreational club for men. It was comprised of a lot of the more affluent members of Troy's society, such as Bill Hayner, pictured on this slide. This would be the Bill Hayner who was president of the Hayner Distilling Company and the husband of Mary Jane Hayner, who built the impressive Hayner Mansion on West Main Street here in Troy. Bill Hayner bought the historic 1874 Dunlap House on Franklin Street and leased it to the Troy Club for many years. The Troy Club seemed to absorb several of the local struggling clubs over the years, such as the Bicycle Club and the Varsity Club. The Troy Club also hosted charity events like lectures, concerts, dinners, and dances. One potential reason for the club's longevity was that it was backed by and received sponsorship from several of Troy's prominent business representatives, including Hayner Distilling, Gummed Products, and Hobart Manufacturing. So while this club also strove for the betterment of society through personal philanthropy, it was also a club for networking and recreation with one's associates. So as a final note, we've looked at 9 historic social clubs of Troy, each with their own purpose, goals, and missions. Some were for public service and charity work, and some were for unwinding and enjoying fellowship with peers. Plenty of social clubs existed for both purposes simultaneously. It should be mentioned that the Troy Museum of History retains a lot of memorabilia for some of the social clubs we talked about. They have the Girls Civic League scrapbook, the Altrurian Club sign that hung outside the clubhouse, and a vintage game owned by the Troy/Varsity Club, among other things. And pictured on this slide here, this is the Leonard Wheeler family of Troy, Ohio, circa 1888. It's not necessarily a club that I know of, but it just kind of goes to show us that they, even at this time, they knew how to cut loose and have a good time. Sometimes we see old pictures and everyone's so prim and sour looking, but when we take a look at this, it kind of shows us they knew how to have fun, and that's what we like about history. There's always something fun to discover. So that is it for Historic Troy Social Clubs. Thank you for listening.